Story 1. The Darkness Within. Emily's eyes burned as she glanced at the clock. 2:37 a.m. The ticking of the second hand felt like a clockwork torture, each tick a reminder of her exhaustion, each tock a beat closer to the biology exam that loomed like a shadow over her mind. Her textbooks were scattered across the desk, notes crumpled in frustration. No matter how hard she tried, the words blurred into meaningless lines and shapes, her mind too fogged with fatigue to focus. The dormitory was eerily silent. The hum of the old building's heating system was the only sound, a low murmur that barely reached her ears. Her roommates had long since gone to bed, and the usual chatter of the hallway had faded into an oppressive quiet. It felt wrong, unnaturally quiet. She looked at the door, half expecting to hear someone pass by, but there was nothing. Her eyelids fluttered as her body demanded rest. She had meant to study for a few more hours, but the weight of exhaustion pulled her down, dragging her into sleep before she even realized it. Emily awoke with a jolt, her body frozen in place. The room was pitch black, the familiar shapes of her desk, chair, and window all swallowed by the darkness. She tried to move, to shift her body, but something heavy pressed down on her chest. Panic surged in her chest as she realized she couldn't move, couldn't even twitch her fingers. Her breath quickened, the air in the room thick and suffocating, as though the darkness itself had weight. She tried to scream, but her voice was caught in her throat, a silent plea for help. The pressure around her intensified. A coldness swept through her, sharp and biting. Her skin crawled as though the air itself was alive, pushing against her from all sides. And then, she felt it, a presence in the corner of the room. Not a shadow, but something darker. A shape, humanoid yet wrong. It was there, watching her, unmoving. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't look away. A whisper slithered through the silence. "You will never escape the darkness within." Her heart skipped. The words were soft, almost comforting, but they were laced with an unmistakable threat. The figure moved, gliding closer to her, and her body trembled, powerless to react. Cold fingers touched her forehead, sending a chill through her very soul before the figure vanished. The silence returned. But this time, it was far worse. It pressed against her, a heavy weight that would not lift. Emily's mind felt like a battlefield, each thought a jagged shard of glass. She had never felt so worn, so utterly drained. The biology exam was less than 12 hours away, but the more she tried to study, the further the material seemed to slip away from her grasp. The words, once so familiar, now twisted into incomprehensible symbols. Each line she read felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. Sleep-deprived and exhausted, she had no choice but to press on, but the more she pushed herself, the more the terror began to creep in. Her nights had become a battlefield between exhaustion and fear, neither giving way. The shadow had returned. It happened again that night. Emily lay in bed, her eyelids fluttering closed against the pull of exhaustion. She told herself she'd rest for just a moment, just enough to ease the tension in her mind. The clock ticked away, counting the minutes she could ill afford to lose. And then, just as before, the darkness crept over her, thick and consuming, swallowing the edges of her consciousness. She woke with a start, her chest tight, her breath shallow. But this time, something was different. She could feel it before she even opened her eyes. The air had grown colder, the silence too complete, as though the world itself had held its breath. Her body was paralyzed, locked in place, her muscles refusing to obey her desperate commands. The shadows in her room seemed to twist and writhe, dark tendrils slithering around the edges of the walls. She could hear them now, whispers, soft and unintelligible, curling around her like a fog. Panic surged, and she tried to scream, but nothing came. Not even a tremor of sound. Her limbs were heavy, as though bound by invisible chains. And then, the figure appeared. This time, it was clearer, taller, its form more defined, yet still horribly wrong. Its face was a blank, shifting mass of shadows, eyes deep pits of darkness. It stood at the foot of her bed, motionless, watching her. A chill settled over her skin, colder than before, colder than the air should allow. You belong to the darkness now, it whispered, its voice like sandpaper on her soul. The words were spoken so calmly, as though they were the truth. The cold touch came next, icy fingers pressing against her forehead, the sensation seeping through her skin, freezing her very bones. The figure leaned in closer, its breath foul and stale, and for a brief moment, Emily thought she might drown in the darkness. Her mind screamed for release, but her body was frozen, held in place by an unseen force. The whisper came again, closer now, its meaning clear, you will never escape. The room felt even colder as the figure faded, leaving Emily alone in the oppressive silence. But she knew deep in her bones, that it wasn't over. The shadow had marked her, and its hunger was far from satisfied. Emily could no longer tell where the exhaustion ended and the terror began. Each day blurred into the next, a haze of sleeplessness and dread. The biology exam was tomorrow, today now, she corrected herself, but it hardly seemed to matter. Her focus had shattered long ago, splintered into countless pieces by the relentless presence that haunted her. She was no longer certain if her mind was breaking from the pressure of finals or if something darker, far older, had taken root in her soul. That night, Emily lay in bed, trembling not from the cold, but from the sheer terror of knowing what was coming. The room was dead silent. Not even the usual creaks of the building could be heard. Only her breath, shallow and strained, filled the stillness. She had reached her breaking point, there was no way she could take another night of this. She would confront it. She would demand answers, even if it cost her sanity. The darkness came swiftly. One moment, the room was still, the next it was thick with that suffocating pressure, the weight of it almost physical. Emily's heart pounded in her chest, but when she tried to move, the paralysis took hold once more. She couldn't even lift a finger, couldn't so much as twitch. The shadow appeared. This time, it wasn't a vague shape at the corner of the room. No, this time it was complete, a hulking mass of swirling blackness, towering over her bed. Its features were clearer now, though still twisted, its face a blank, shifting void, eyes like empty pits of despair. The air grew icy, colder than anything she had ever felt, biting through her clothes and into her skin. You cannot escape, it whispered, its voice like an echo of something ancient, like it had always been there, waiting for her. The words sent a tremor through her body, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. Summoning every ounce of willpower she had left, Emily found her voice. What are you? Her words were shaky, weak, but they were her own. The entity leaned closer, its presence suffocating. I am what you have become. She couldn't breathe. The cold consumed her, wrapping itself around her lungs, crushing her chest. But somehow, through sheer defiance, she broke free from the paralysis. She forced herself to sit up, heart racing, the room spinning around her. The figure hesitated, as though confused. You're not real. Emily screamed, her voice raw, shaking. The shadow hissed, its form shuddering, but it didn't retreat. It loomed, still hungry, still waiting. And as it whispered once more, this is only the beginning, Emily knew that whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Story 2. The Silent Witness. Sarah had never felt so alone. The farmhouse stood at the edge of the world, nestled within the embrace of thick, dark woods that seemed to press in on her from all sides. It was old, built decades ago, perhaps centuries, and its creaky bones groaned under the weight of time. The isolation was supposed to be a sanctuary. A chance to escape the hum of the city, the constant noise that had eaten away at her peace of mind for years. But now, standing in the doorway with the key still in her hand, she wondered if she'd made a grave mistake. The wind howled outside, carrying with it the scent of rain and earth. Lightning flashed intermittently, illuminating the desolate landscape in quick bursts of white. The farmhouse was far from cozy. It felt more like a tomb. The walls, yellowed with age, were lined with heavy curtains that blocked any hint of natural light, as though the house itself was hiding from the world. Inside, the place was furnished with old, mismatched pieces, antique chairs, a rusted fireplace, and shelves filled with books that hadn't been touched in decades. Yet, despite the silence, Sarah didn't feel calm. The place had an unsettling stillness that clung to the air, pressing down on her chest, making her feel small and insignificant. She shook the feeling off. It was just nerves. She would get used to it, she thought. Unpacking was mechanical. She placed her things in the guest room, an old, narrow bed beneath a window sealed tight by faded curtains. The room seemed untouched by time, as though the space had been preserved just for her. The thought should have been comforting, but there was a strange heaviness in the room, a tension she couldn't shake. The air was thick, unnaturally still. She sighed, trying to focus on the work ahead. Sarah had been writing her novel for months, but the pressure of the deadline weighed heavily on her. The storm outside became fiercer, thunder rattling the windows as if warning her. She went to bed early, exhausted by the day's travel, only to find sleep elusive. When her eyes finally closed, the oppressive silence of the house seemed to swallow her whole. Sleep was supposed to bring relief, but instead, it was as if something was watching. Something was waiting. The darkness around her shifted. She awoke, her heart pounding, but her body refused to obey. The shadows in the corner of the room were moving, flickering just beyond her sight. Something was there, someone, and Sarah couldn't move to confront it. Her throat tightened. Her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps. There was no escape. The terror of the unseen presence suffocated her as the room grew colder, the darkness deeper. The storm hadn't let up. The wind howled louder, slamming against the walls like a beast trying to break through. Inside, the house was cold, the fire in the hearth long since gone out. Sarah sat at the wooden desk, her hands shaking as she tried to force her thoughts into some semblance of order. She had been writing, but the words felt hollow, distant, like they came from someone else. Her mind kept drifting to the strange feeling that had crept over her in the dark of night, the suffocating presence in the room, the whispers she couldn't understand. Was it the house? The isolation? Or something worse? Her exhaustion weighed on her shoulders like a 100-pound stone. She hadn't slept properly in days, and now it was catching up with her. Her head ached, her eyes stung from staring at the screen for too long. She rubbed them, trying to shake off the sense of unease that had rooted itself deep within her chest. As the storm raged outside, Sarah thought she saw something, a flicker in the corner of her eye, something too quick to catch. She turned her head sharply, but nothing was there. The feeling, though, didn't go away. She could feel it, a presence, just out of sight, waiting, watching. The temperature in the room dropped, and Sarah's breath became visible in the air, a thin mist rising from her lips. She shivered and wrapped her arms tighter around her, but it didn't help. The cold seeped into her bones, into her very soul. She glanced around the room, her pulse quickening. The shadows, darker than the rest of the room, shifted as if they were alive, moving in ways they shouldn't. She stood, wanting to check the windows, to make sure nothing was outside, but as she turned, the paralysis hit her. Her body locked, her feet glued to the floor. The air grew heavier, and the pressure in her chest tightened until it was almost unbearable. She couldn't breathe. Then, it appeared. In the corner of the room, just beyond the flickering candlelight, a shadow took form, tall, formless, yet undeniably there. It wasn't human. Its shape was monstrous, like a silhouette of something too twisted for words. As she stared, frozen, the figure seemed to shift, a grotesque distortion of itself, as if the darkness itself were alive and watching her. The whispers, soft at first, now grew louder, hissing, unintelligible words that wrapped around her like chains. Her heart raced. She tried to scream, but her throat was tight, her mouth dry. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. The figure slowly approached, its presence suffocating her as the cold grew more intense. The entity was real. And it wasn't going to let her go. The house was suffocating. The storm outside had become a furious, violent force, its howling winds hammering against the walls. Sarah had lost track of time. Had it been days? Weeks? All she knew was that the isolation had grown unbearable. The shadows had become thicker, darker, their movements more purposeful. The whispers had evolved into words now, each one chilling her to the core. Every night, the presence grew stronger, feeding on her fear, tightening its grip until she could hardly breathe. She hadn't slept in days. Her exhaustion was all-consuming. Her body ached, her eyes bloodshot, but the terror never let her rest. Every time she closed her eyes, the darkness pressed in, suffocating her. It felt like something was waiting just beyond her reach, watching her. Waiting for her to break. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, she had made a decision. She would confront it. The fear, the exhaustion, the whispers, they had become unbearable. If she didn't face it now, she would lose herself to it entirely. She had to know what was real. She had to understand why this entity had chosen her. The moment she lay down in bed, it came. The room grew cold, too cold, as though the temperature had dropped by 10 degrees in an instant. Her breath came in shallow gasps as the paralysis struck, rendering her immobile once more. The pressure returned, as though the very air around her had solidified. She could feel the entity, its presence hovering over her like a shadow, its breath cold and foul. Then, the figure emerged. It was taller than before, its shape now more defined, its twisted face a grotesque mask of malice. Its eyes, black as tar, bored into hers, and Sarah felt her heart stumble in her chest. It was no longer a shadow. It was a monster, alive with hunger. "I am what you have become," it whispered, its voice like a rasp, a dying breath in her ear. "I am your fear. Your isolation. Your deepest regret." The words made no sense, but the terror they evoked was undeniable. Sarah struggled to break free, but the paralysis held her tight, each movement heavier than the last. "You are nothing," she whispered through clenched teeth, forcing the words out. "You can't have me." The entity leaned closer, its form shifting and writhing. The cold deepened. "You can never leave." The words burned through her mind, scarring her thoughts, as the figure reached for her. In one final, desperate act, Sarah clenched her fists, summoning every ounce of will she had left. With a scream she could hardly hear, she broke free from the paralysis. She shot up from the bed, her body trembling, her heart racing. The entity recoiled, its form flickering like a dying flame. "This is only the beginning," it whispered, as it vanished into the shadows. Sarah gasped for breath, the room suddenly warmer, though the coldness inside her remained. She didn't know if she had one. She didn't know if it was over. But she knew one thing, she had come face to face with the darkness within. And it wasn't finished with her yet. Story 3. Whispers in the Walls. Jack Sinclair stood at the foot of the mansion, staring up at its imposing silhouette against the darkening sky. The wind whipped through the trees, carrying with it the smell of salt water from the cliffs below. The mansion loomed like a forgotten monument to a long-past era, its cracked windows and decaying facade adding to its air of abandonment. To anyone else, it would seem like a place best avoided, but to Jack, it was just another job. An old relative of the Abernathy family had reached out, asking for an inspection of the property's structure, and Jack had accepted the task without much thought. The isolation of the mansion didn't bother him. It should have been peaceful, even serene, a perfect retreat from the chaos of city life. But as he stepped inside, the air felt thick, heavier than he had expected. The front door creaked open with an eerie sound, as though the house itself was sighing in relief at his arrival. Inside, the mansion was cold, the faint scent of mildew clinging to the walls. The grand entry hall stretched out before him, dimly lit by the weak glow of the few candles he had brought. Dust hung in the air, unmoved by the wind, as if the house hadn't been disturbed in years. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of the wooden beams above. Jack set his bag down, his footsteps echoing on the worn marble floors as he began to move through the house. His mind was still focused on the job. He would inspect the structure, make a report, and leave. The sooner he finished, the sooner he could escape the eerie atmosphere. He had never been one to entertain supernatural ideas, logic and reason were his allies. There was nothing here but an old house, a bit too far from civilization for comfort. But then, the first whisper came. It was soft, barely perceptible, but it lingered in the stillness. Jack froze, turning sharply to the empty hallway behind him. His heart thudded in his chest as he tried to make sense of the sound. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the house settling. The hairs on the back of his neck prickled. The silence pressed in on him once again, only this time it was different. He wasn't alone. And that feeling of being watched, it never left. The wind howled louder as the night deepened, but Jack didn't notice the storm's fury as he moved through the mansion's endless halls. He was trying to focus on the task at hand, checking the structural integrity, marking up the walls, measuring the floorboards. The mansion was far too large for a single man to inspect in one night, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house had an oppressive air, like it was breathing around him, shifting, watching. Every room he entered seemed colder than the last. The fireplaces, though intact, offered no warmth. The old wood beneath his feet creaked ominously as he made his way to the library, a room filled with dust and forgotten memories. Shelves lined with old books stood in stark contrast to the emptiness of the space. He felt drawn to a small desk near the back, its surface covered with yellowed papers and brittle leather-bound journals. He hesitated for a moment, then pulled open a drawer. Inside, an old journal sat on top of a stack of papers, its pages worn, ink faded in places but still legible. Jack ran a finger along the spine, feeling the texture of time itself in the book's cover. He sat down and opened it, scanning the first few pages. The entries were from an Abernathy, perhaps one of the last, judging by the date. The journal described strange events, things that seemed so out of place for a logical mind, whispers in the walls, an oppressive presence that grew with each passing day, the feeling of being followed by eyes that no one could see. The last entry, dated just before the family had disappeared, sent a cold shiver down his spine. "I hear them. They are not dead, not gone. They are here, whispering from the walls. I cannot escape them. They won't let me leave." A chill ran through Jack, and his breath became shallow. He shook his head. This was just a delusion, a product of isolation. He had to focus. He needed to finish this and leave. But as he placed the journal down, the air shifted. The temperature dropped, and for the briefest moment, Jack thought he saw something, a figure, dark and shifting, at the end of the hallway. He blinked, and it was gone. His pulse quickened, but Jack shook it off. "It's just the house," he told himself, "it's just the old wood creaking." But the whispers came again. This time, clearer. "You can't leave, Jack. We won't let you." The hairs on his neck stood upright. His heart raced. He wasn't alone. And he couldn't move. Jack tried to steady his breath, his body trembling as he stood motionless in the dark hallway. The whispers had become impossible to ignore, now loud and distinct, flowing from the very walls like a river of despair. The temperature had plummeted, the air sharp with an unnatural cold that gnawed at his skin. His fingers clenched the journal in his hand, but his mind was elsewhere, too caught in the haunting reality that had slowly, relentlessly, encroached on his logic. The mansion, with its sprawling rooms and endless corridors, now felt like a labyrinth designed to trap him. No longer just an old building in need of repair, it had become something far more sinister, alive with malevolent intent. He could hear the whispering again, not just in the walls, but from the very floor beneath his feet, as if the house itself was trying to speak directly to him. "You can't leave. You belong to us." His heart pounded in his chest, panic rising like a wave, threatening to drown him. But his body refused to move. His legs felt rooted to the floor, heavy, as though his muscles had turned to stone. The weight of the house pressed in on him, crushing his lungs, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his throat tightened, but his mind screamed for action. He had to get out. He had to. A noise behind him stopped him cold, a scraping sound, like fingernails against wood. Slowly, he turned, dread flooding his veins. At the far end of the hallway stood a figure, faint at first, its form indistinct, but as his eyes focused, it became clearer. The silhouette of a man, tall and gaunt, his face shrouded in darkness, just beyond the dim flicker of his candlelight. The figure didn't move. It simply watched. Jack's blood ran cold. He tried to speak, to shout, but his voice was locked in his throat. He could feel his heart beating louder now, each thud a reminder that he was alive, but also entirely powerless. The whispers swirled around him, a cacophony of voices. The figure took a step forward, its movement unnaturally smooth, gliding toward him as though it was walking through the air itself. The room grew colder still, the darkness in the corners deepening, swallowing the light from the candles. "You can't escape, Jack. You will never leave." The walls felt like they were closing in. He wanted to run, to scream, but he couldn't move. The terror consumed him, and in that moment, he realized, the house wasn't just a home, it was a prison. The figure took another step. Jack's body froze. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. All he could hear was the whisper of his own dread, growing louder, louder, until it was the only thing he could hear. The house had him. The entity had him. And there was no escape.